Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining our Attuned webinar this afternoon here in Tokyo time. So today we'll be presenting about getting started with people analytics. And we have a guest presenter, Daniel Bedoni, who is joining us from Budapest. How are things in Budapest this morning there, Daniel?
It's windy and cold. Hi, everyone.
It is cold here in Tokyo, so that is similar, but we don't have the wind. So I'm Casey, I'll be the moderator here. Before I turn it over to Daniel to tell us, how we can navigate this big data revolution that is coming to HR that we've all heard about. And he's going to be taking us through all the steps of how do you deal with people analytics, what's true, what's not true, some kind of simple tasks that we can to set up our organizations. Let me introduce Daniel. So Daniel was actually one of the creators of Attuned originally. He's won some HR tech recognition at different people analytics conferences throughout the world. And he's now the faculty lead for data-driven HR from the Budapest Business School and Spark Institute there in Budapest. So Daniel's going to be our expert today. I'm going to hand it over to him. He's going to take us through the slides and teach us all about getting started with people analytics. Then I'll come back and follow up with some questions and help moderate for the group. So Daniel, over to you.
Thanks very much for the kind words and the introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar on getting started with people analytics. Just a few words about what we're going to cover and not cover today. So when you look at people analytics and HR analytics trainings and conference presentations around the world, many of them talk about case studies and best practices and maturity models out there. And to some extent, those are very useful because they can help you understand where you are compared to the market. But they also have their limits because, as the great Russian writer Tolstoy has said, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So there is a limit to what you can learn from case studies, and a limit to how applicable they might be to your specific situation, your company size, your industry, and your business situation. So what we are going to do today is not cover case studies, but rather show you a methodology which you can apply in your own organization, regardless of what industry you're in, regardless of what company size you're in, and even regardless of what position you fill within HR. So we'll show you a methodology that will hopefully be helpful to you in getting started with people analytics. Now, this methodology, before we go into it, I think it's helpful to define what people analytics is. There isn't mutually or commonly accepted kind of worldwide definition. Every practitioner, I think, at this point is free to make up their own. What you can see here is my definition of what people analytics is. And I see it as sort of an analytical, so hypothesis and proof-driven problem-solving methodology applied to organizational and people issues that have a measurable business impact, and using advanced predictive analytics and machine learning. So these are sort of the four aspects of people analytics in my experience. And if you'd like to get started with it, we'll show you a few steps that you can take today. We won't have time to cover everything, but we'll kind of cover in more detail the first 4 steps of the methodology that we teach at the International Business School here in Budapest. So we'll talk about how to identify a problem and its impact, how to break down and measure a problem, and how to interpret data. That's our scope today. About step 1, identifying the problem and the impact. This is really, I think, one of the key steps when you start people analytics. I talk to HR leaders a lot, and one of the things they tell me in these courses and outside is that they really want to restore the strategic function of HR, or strategic value adding aspect of HR. They want to see, they want HR to be seen as a strategic value adding function. And the key to that, I think, is to really use HR to solve business problems. So this first step is about translating a business problem into an HR problem solving that HR problem with the toolkit and solutions available to HR, and then showing the business impact and the business result of that HR solution. So I came up with a few laws of people analytics, if you like, and the first of these would be that people analytics really strives to solve business problems with the toolkit of HR. I think it's worth talking a little bit about what is the general methodology of problem solving. So analysis means, it's a Greek word, and it means breaking things up into smaller chunks. One of the things I noticed in my own personal life in August is that I put on a lot of weight. I was around 10 kilos heavier in August than I should have been. So I started kind of looking at this problem. What are the root causes of it? And I came up with sort of 3 potential causes. One is maybe around how I eat. The second is maybe around how I do sports. And the third possibility is maybe that I don't get enough sleep. And even these sub-problems can be broken up further. So if it's about eating habits, maybe I'm eating too much, or maybe I'm not eating very healthily. If it's about doing sports, maybe it's about doing sort of weightlifting and building strength, or maybe it's about doing cardio, swimming or running or that type of thing. And analyzing this problem, I came up with this picture of things, and I realized that I wasn't eating too much, but I was eating unhealthy things like pizza a lot. And I was doing some weightlifting, but not enough cardio, not enough swimming or running. And definitely I wasn't getting enough sleep. So breaking down this problem of weight loss, I could identify some actionable things for me to do. And I'm happy to report that I lost around 5 kilos since then. Christmas has kind of put this result into doubt a little bit, but I'm back on track now that the new year has started. Now, there are different ways to break up a problem, and if you've worked at consulting firms, they'll tell you that the ideal way to break up a problem is called the mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive type of segmentation. So when you're trying to think of what are the root causes of a problem, then it's helpful to break it up in a way so that every potential reason falls into exactly one category, and your segmentation covers every possible case. So if you look at these 3 ways to segment, for example, your employees, then you can see that only one of these is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. The first one in the top row doesn't cover people above 65, so it's not collectively exhaustive. And the second one in the middle row, you can see that people who are 20 years old or 30 years old could potentially fall into 2 different categories, so it's not mutually exclusive. So really the only good way to break up your employee population is the third one. The reason why I emphasize this kind of problem solving and analysis methodologies because it can really help you speed up your problem solving process. So a lot of times when we teach the data-driven HR program at the International Business School, we see people sort of trying to brainstorm what the potential reasons are of a problem. But if you look at a problem like, for example, employee retention, how to retain and not lose your top talent, there are potentially hundreds of reasons that can spring into mind into why people are leaving. And that is not a helpful way to break up a problem because you won't have the time and the resources to collect data on all those hundreds of potential reasons. And if you use this mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive methodology, you can really break down a problem much faster, and you can really identify the root cause much more cheaply and quickly. And I'll show you an example where we will translate a business problem into an HR problem with this segmentation. Let's suppose that you're working at a company as an HR leader where the CEO comes to you with this sort of bad news that, you know, we're not being profitable this year, and you want to contribute to solving this problem as an HR leader. Now, if you begin to break down this problem, you can easily see that there are only two possible causes of not being profitable. If you look at profit, it's revenue minus cost. So your problem is that you either not have enough revenue or either you have too much cost. There is really no other reason that can be behind this problem. Now, if you try to break this down further, let's say we know that the problem is we don't have enough revenue. We asked for some data from our CFO, and we now know that this is where we need to look further. What can these be a result of? What can this problem be a result of? Now, revenue, you can sort of conceptualize it as the number of units sold times the unit price. So how many of whatever you're selling you have sold and for how much. So there is two potential reasons for not having enough revenue. Either your sales volume is low or your sales price is low. There is no other reason if you segment it this way. Let's suppose you also have data on this from your CFO, and you can see that really the problem is not so much the low sales price, but really the low sales volume is where you need to dig a little bit further. Now, where can low sales volume come from? What can be the reasons for not having enough sales? Again, you can conceptualize it as sort of an equation where there are only two possible reasons for this. Sales volume can be conceptualized as how many sales representatives you have and how many units or products or hours of services they sell. So if you have low sales volume, it's either because you don't have enough sales representatives or those sales representatives are not selling enough. And I think what you can see here is that in just 3 steps, we have arrived from a business problem to an HR problem. So if you don't have enough sales representatives, then it's a hiring problem. And if those sales representatives are not selling enough, it's a productivity problem or a performance problem. So very quickly with this type of segmentation, we've arrived at a stage where your business problem really has an HR problem as its root cause. And when we do this exercise at the business school, some HR leaders remark that, maybe the real reason behind these things is not an HR problem. Maybe there is new competition, maybe the demand is going down, so the market has changed a little bit. And I think that's true. So maybe the root cause ultimately will not be an HR problem, but I think we can see here that HR is in a position to react to that problem, and HR can definitely be part of the solution. So even if the market is changing, and that's why your sales reps are not productive enough, then HR can be part of the solution in providing training, in providing performance management, in providing incentives to solve that business problem. Now, looking at the methodology a bit further, there are different data collection methods that you can use when you're trying to break down a problem. Some of them are quantitative and some of them are qualitative. Some of them are external and some of them are internal. So it's always helpful, whatever problem you're dealing with, to have external numbers, quantitative data. So for example, industry benchmarks, as well as internal numbers. So for example, KPIs. And it's always helpful to do interviews. I think qualitative data gathering is such an important part of people analytics for 3 reasons, really. Qualitative research can help you orient yourself in a problem. So when you have a big, undefined, difficult to break down problem, you won't be able to collect data on every single aspect of that problem. But if you talk to people externally, to your clients, to market experts, or internally with line managers and so on, you can kind of identify the key themes and the key trends and kind of know where to look and where to start gathering data. Qualitative research can also have explanatory power. So a lot of times your numbers can show you correlations or relationships between different things, but they don't necessarily show cause and effect. And in those cases, it's really helpful to have sort of a qualitative picture of the world around you, because those interviews will help you sort of identify what's the cause and effect relationship there. And the third reason is that as much as we would like to think that we are rational beings, human beings are very often emotional, and you know, neuroscience says actually that all our decisions are based on emotions. So a lot of times people's feelings and opinions are just as important an aspect of reality as the things that you can capture with hard data. So the second law of people analytics would be that we tend to use both internal and external data, and both quantitative and qualitative research in our work. Now, how do you find trends in the data? There are, of course, different ways, but there are the simplest ways to get started is to look at trends over time. So if you are unprofitable this year, what was the picture like last year? What was the picture in Q1, in Q2, in Q3 this year? So this is one way to start seeing trends in the data. Another way is to look at different levels of granularity. If you're unprofitable this year, what does that mean in terms of our business units? Are some of them profitable and some of them not? What's the kind of more detailed picture there? And then you can also zoom out and look at the competitors, the wider economy. What is this market situation that you're dealing with? And that can also help you identify trends in the data. So whenever you're looking at a problem, it's helpful to look at how it's evolved over time and what does it look like at different levels of granularity. Another helpful heuristics is funnels. So in a lot of situations, for example, if you're trying to analyze your recruitment process, funnels are a very helpful tool to apply. You can look at your recruitment funnel, for example, look at how many number of applicants you get, how many of those pass screening and the different interview rounds, how many of them accept your offers. One of the HR leaders in our last data-driven HR course told me that one of her KPIs was the percentage of offers that candidates accepted at her company, because they really want to make sure their employer brand and their value proposition and their interview process is attractive enough for candidates, and that most people, as many people as possible, accept the offers that they get. And then, of course, once people join the company, you can take this further and look at how many of these people stay at the company, how many of them possibly or successfully pass probation, how many of them are still at the company and productive after a year, after 2 years. So the funnel can be extended further. In a lot of situations, looking at these conversion rates will be a helpful tool. And of course, this is something we borrowed from marketing, and this is what a large part of marketing analytics is about, looking at funnels and looking at the conversion at the different stages of these funnels. All right, so we've seen how we can break down a business problem into possible HR problems. So we saw that we're not being profitable this year, and this is either because we have a hiring problem or we have a performance problem. How can we break this down further? Let's suppose that we have identified the root cause of the problem as having too much employee turnover. Really, the reason why our sales reps are not productive enough is because they churn at a high rate, and we have to onboard new starters who don't have so much experience. And really, the best way to solve this profitability problem is to reduce employee turnover. Now, this is still a huge problem. A lot of companies don't know how to get started and how to deal with employee turnover. So we need to segment this problem further. And one very helpful way to do that is to just be like a little child and just to keep asking why, and to keep asking questions to understand this problem. One very helpful way is just to look at every word in this problem statement and start asking questions about every single word. If you look at turnover, for example, what type of turnover is it? Is it voluntary turnover or involuntary turnover? What is the percentage there? Is it high performers who are leaving, or sort of a mix of high, average, and low performers? If you look at sort of employees, what type of employees? You can segment employee groups by tenure, how long they've been at your company, by salary level. Is it, you know, people with below average salaries, for example, who are leaving, by performance rating, by that teams or divisions engagement level, by the time since their last promotion, and in many other ways. You can also look at the word too much and sort of start analyzing that and segmenting that further. What does that mean compared to what? Do we have too much employee turnover compared to the best places to work, compared to our competitors, compared to ourselves in the past? What would be the ideal level? What would be the financial impact of the change? And this is really, really important to quantify that as much as possible. And if you look at people analytics case studies, this is a relatively easy thing to do, to quantify the financial impact of turnover. And a lot of times companies, people analytics teams start precisely with this problem because it's relatively easy to quantify the financial impact of the change. Not necessarily a good approach if you don't have problems with employee turnover. So don't start with this problem just because it's relatively easy. Start with it because it's important to you and you expect a big financial return on solving it. And if you look at the word we, what does that mean? Which business units, which divisions, which teams, under which managers? For example, maybe your rookie, inexperienced managers are kind of driving more employee turnover than the experienced ones, or maybe it's the other way around. Is there anything in common among those divisions? For example, frequent changes in strategy or in management or in headcount? So there's really a number of things you can ask that will help you orient your research. And most companies have already some level of data on these things, or if they don't, it's relatively easy pieces of data to collect without doing any sort of advanced analytics. But you can already get quite far in understanding the reasons for your problem just by doing this simple exercise. So the third law of people analytics, I think, is that people analytics professionals tend to be very curious and tend to ask too many questions. They tend to annoy their colleagues a little bit with all of their questions in their quest to identify the root causes of the problem. Measuring the problem is sort of a science in itself, and we're going to cover it in a bit of detail here. I brought you a picture of a hand over this electric stove, which is turned on, and I think most of you would probably not put your hand on this heater because you know you would get burnt, right? So we humans learn from experience. There's always some sort of event. For example, I put my hand on this stove and it's switched on, and then there is an outcome, which will most likely be a pain and a burn on my hands. And from this, I draw a takeaway. I take away the fact that I'd better not put my hand on the stove when it is on. So this is how we learn. There is some sort of input, an event, some sort of outcome, and then we draw conclusions from these. And this is exactly how machines learn as well. So if you look at AlphaGo, the software that Google's developed that beat the best Go player in the world, this is exactly what they did in the first case. So they just gave the computer a lot of games so that it could learn what moves the players made and sort of the outcome as well. So which players won in those games. And from these two data points, the moves that the players made and who the winner was, the computer could learn what moves it had to make to win. So machines learn in very similar ways than humans. There has been a newer version of this software since then, which learned a bit differently, but this is how the first version learned, and this is how most machine learning algorithms still learn. So really to understand what people analytics is about, I think it's very helpful to understand this simple equation that you always look for some kind of event, some kind of input, and some kind of outcome. And by correlating these two, you can arrive at data-driven takeaways and learnings that are useful. Let's look at an HR example to bring this home a little bit more. Your input, for example, if you're recording your candidate's performance in the interview process, you can sort of record candidates' performance in different steps of the selection process. How they've done at selection tests, for example, or if you have an interview scorecard, how they've been rated by interviewers in their different interviews. And then you look at which of these candidates end up becoming high performers at your company. That would be the outcome. And then by looking at these two sort of data points, you can really learn what selection methods are really good at predicting future performance. This is exactly what a lot of people have already done. So psychologists have studied this a lot. Schmidt and Hunter have made a pretty interesting and very comprehensive study where they looked at around 100 studies that examined the validity of selection methods, and they identified which hiring methods or screening methods have the most predictive power when it comes to hiring people. And what they've seen is that cognitive ability coupled with another measure like integrity tests or conscientiousness tests or a work sample test or structured interviews give the best result in terms of predictive validity, in terms of predicting who your top performers will be. And a lot of the things that we tend to look at in our hiring processes, such as resume data, the years of work experience, or how many years the person spent in education, don't have too much validity at all. So very often we're looking at the wrong things when we are hiring people. And this study is quoted in the book of Laszlo Bock, who was the VP of People Operations at Google. He wrote an excellent book called Work Rules, and this is really kind of one of the things they looked at when they revamped Google's hiring process and changed how it worked. So I think what you can see here is that people analytics strives to connect the dots on the employee journey. So you have data points, for example, from your selection process, and then you also have data, for example, from your performance management, the performance review process. You might have a structured interview scorecard from the one and performance KPIs from the other. And when you do people analytics, you really look at these sort of two different points of data, and you identify what your reliable selection methods are. What are the selection methods that can predict the top performers at your company? So the fifth law of people analytics would be that we strive to make employee experience measurable at as many steps of the employee journey as possible, and then we strive to connect these dots using data. This is sometimes difficult for larger companies where the HR organization is very siloed. So you might have a recruitment team that has the recruitment data, and then you might have a talent management or talent development team that has the performance data, and these data might be sitting in different systems, and it might be difficult to sort of gather all of these and connect the dots, but it's really a core aspect of people analytics. The sixth law of people analytics, I think you could see from this study that I've quoted from Schmidt and Hunter, is that we rely on the results of scientific research. So there's been a lot of research in psychology, in neuroscience, in sociology, in network science, and in other domains that are really directly relevant to HR problems. And it really helps to be familiar with this research. You don't have to have a degree in any of these fields, but it's always a good idea to do some research when you're facing a specific problem of, for example, employee turnover. Just look at what psychologists have written about employee turnover in the past, and you will find hundreds and hundreds of really, really interesting, valuable articles, research-based, data-driven articles about the potential reasons for employee turnover, which can help you formulate a hypothesis on the potential reasons. It is always helpful if you want to measure a problem to have a good grasp of the HR technology market. So very often it's going to be a lot cheaper to use an off-the-shelf solution than to develop your own sort of analytics software. You know, all of the they've invested millions of dollars into research and developing their solution. So it isn't often it isn't a good idea to you know, rebuild these things, because it's going to take you years and millions of dollars to build your own thing. It's often the best idea to just buy the best solution that best fits your needs from the market. But it can be difficult because there are, you know, around 1,500 HR technology software solutions out there. So it takes a bit of time to get to know the market. I think it's really worth it. And if you want to get started, I think it's a good idea to do, you know, one quick demo every week, maybe a paid pilot every quarter. Definitely do involve experts to validate these products, scientific and analytics background. So you don't want to you know, invest tens of thousands of dollars into a solution without having asked, you know, a psychologist or a data scientist inside your company or maybe outside what they think about the way this product works. It's helpful to understand who the competitors are, so you can compare them. A lot of companies also A/B test different software solutions in the same category. For example, they do a pilot with a small group, maybe 100 people, and they try a couple of different products in the same category to see which one works best for them. It's very, very important also to involve employees and communicate transparently whenever you try to measure anything, because if you treat employees as sort of you know, inputs who give you data, not as human beings who should benefit from gathering that data, and then you will very quickly create a backlash against measuring anything. So what you want to do is really explain to people very transparently what you're measuring, why you're measuring it, what is the outcome, what will the managers, what will HR, what will the employees themselves see from that measurement, and what you're planning to do with it. So what kind of actions you're hoping to implement on the back of these measurements, and what kind of actions you're not going to implement. So for example, you're not going to fire anyone just because they gave you a little bit of data. It's also very important to take action after you measure something. So if you just measure things, but you don't take action, then again, you're going to get at the same type of backlash where people feel they're just giving you data, giving you information, but nothing ever gets done, nothing ever improves, and they'll just stop giving you information after a while and maybe become more disengaged than they were to start with. So really one thing that's very helpful when doing any sort of people analytics project and measuring anything is really over communicate the process and the goals and the outcomes by a factor of 10. So communicate about it as much as possible to the point where you're bored with your own messaging, but people still need to hear it. It's also very helpful to engage with HR technology vendors. So give them feedback, tell them what you like, tell them what you don't like. Feel free to give them feature requests. Very often they'll be happy to implement specific custom features for you. So you can kind of make it a co-development, iterative co-development process with your HR technology vendor to make sure you get the solution in the long term that you need. So I think people analytics does require and definitely involves very active HR technology vendor management. It's just part of the job now. HR has to know the software solutions out there. There are literally hundreds and thousands of software solutions, and as HR professionals, we need to have an image of what that market looks like. And another very important law of people analytics that I've put up here is that the reasons and the outcome of people analytics projects should be very, very, very transparent to employees. Now, how do you interpret the data that you get from measurements? This is a subject we could talk about for weeks, but I'm just going to give you a couple of helpful pointers and things to look out for that will hopefully be helpful for you in any situation. So how do you know if a person is tall, for example? When I lived in Japan, I was very happy because I seemed like rather a tall person in Japan. Here in Hungary, I'm more like average, maybe on the short side of average. And the way we know that is, of course, by comparing, people to other people. So the only way to know whether someone is tall is to compare them to others and see where they fall within that group. And height, as it turns out, is distributed normally. Normal distributions are a very helpful statistical phenomenon to understand because they're everywhere. A lot of things that we deal with in HR have normal distributions. And what normal distributions mean is just the fact that you have this kind of bell-shaped curve where most of the people are in the middle. So around 70% of people are not too far from the average. And some people around 26, 27% are sort of a little bit farther from the average. So they are exceptional in this way or the other way. And there are really very few people who are at either end of the two scales or the extremes. So for example, height is distributed like this. Most people are sort of average height. There are a few people who are a little bit taller, some who are a little bit shorter, and there are very, very few giants or midgets. So most of us are average in terms of height, also in terms of IQ. So IQ is also normally distributed. Most of us are somewhere around the average. Personality traits, some things like conscientiousness or openness to new information or emotional stability are also normally distributed. This is part of the reason why psychologists don't really like the mixed Breyer's, I always forget the name, the MBTI test anyway. The reason why psychologists don't like it too much is because it puts you in boxes. So it says you're either an introvert or an extrovert. Whereas in reality, most of us, 70% of us are somewhere in the middle, not extremely extroverted, nor extremely introverted. So rather than putting people into boxes, it's helpful to understand that most of us are somewhere in the middle. Some of us have slightly stronger preferences in either direction. It is the same when it comes to motivational preferences. So attuned, for example, measures motivational values. Most of us are, again, somewhere in the middle. Some of us have slightly more extreme preferences towards either way. So for example, how much you like autonomy, or how much you need to be in an innovative environment, how much are you motivated by having very clear rules, for example. These are all things that have a normal distribution. Survey results too. So whenever HR runs any surveys, it's very interesting and important to know that the results will be normally distributed most of the time. Interestingly, the distribution of performance in the overall population is also like this. So most of us are average performers, and there are some people who are slightly better or worse. Let's go back to survey results a bit, because I think that's a very important thing to understand. And one mistake I see HR departments make too many times is the interpretation of survey data. So let's say you've run a survey and you've asked, a few people, in this example, 12 people, to evaluate a question, for example, how much feedback they are getting at work. And most of the people answered with 4, and some people answered with 5 or with 3 or 2. Now, a lot of HR departments would make the mistake of thinking that this is a good result because most of the people answered with 4. So we're not doing too bad. But in reality, what this means is that the average answer on this question is 4. So we don't know if 4 is a good answer or not. 4 is an average answer in this case because most people have replied with 4, but it doesn't mean that it's a good result. It means that 4 is the average, and 5 is a good result here. Let's say you have another question, for example, how satisfied people are with their salaries. And to this question, most people replied with 3, some people higher, some people lower, but most of them replied with 3. What does this mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad result. It just means that 3 is the average answer here, and 4 and 5 would be a good result, and 2 and 1 would be a below average result. But you can't interpret the raw data in itself without looking at the distribution when you are looking at survey results. Another important distribution to keep in mind is sort of the exponential power law distributions. A lot of things in the world are distributed like this as well. For example, popularity or success in the traditional sense. So wealth and salaries as well. There are just a few, very few people who are extremely popular or extremely wealthy, and a lot of us sort of this long tail who have a lot less in terms of popularity or wealth. Communication works the same way. So at any company or in any sort of community, there are always just a few people who are really sort of the hubs, the influencers within that community who are connected to a large number of people, whereas most of us have sort of a similar, much lower number of connections. So when you're looking at communication, it's really, really helpful to understand who those influencers are and who are those people who have a lot more connections than others at the company. And this is what organizational network analysis does, for example, which is a fairly popular and fairly new field within people analytics. Interestingly, the distribution of performance in successful teams is said to be like this according to research. So according to research, the best teams are where there are just a couple of top performers, really exceptional, really outstanding people, and most of the others on the team are average performance. So it's not good to have too many stars on a team. There have been very many experiments with humans as well as animals that have proven that if you have too many stars on a team, they're going to not have a good dynamic. You only want just 1 or 2 really big top performers, and then distribute it differently. So it's always interesting to understand the distribution of your data. Whenever you're looking at any data points, make sure you look at the distribution. Is it normally distributed? Is it exponentially distributed? So that you can interpret the meaning of that data. A little bit about the algorithms, sort of the advanced analytics that we tend to use in people analytics. So these are machine learning algorithms, and they come in different shapes and forms and sizes. I think if you just understand the 3 basic algorithms, it's going to give you a great start. There are classification algorithms, regression, and clustering algorithms that are commonly used in many of the HR technology solutions out there, and which you can use in your own people analytics projects. Classification algorithms predict a category using numbers. So if you use a classification algorithms, you have numbers as your input. For example, what is the age of your employees? What is the salary level of your employees? What is the performance rating of your employees? And you have a category as an outcome. For example, has the person resigned or not? And this is one way, for example, to predict employee turnover, to use a classification algorithm. You can look at different numbers about your employees and then you can look at whether they've resigned or not, and then use that classification algorithm to predict who is going to resign at your company. Regression algorithms, by contrast, they predict a number from another number. So for example, let's say you have a structured interview scorecard where your interviewers give ratings to the candidates based on their interview performance. And then you also have performance KPIs once those people have joined your company. Now you can look at these two sets of numbers using regression algorithms and figure out the relationship. Is there a relationship between the two? For example, people who are rated very high at a specific interview question or by an interviewer tend to perform a lot better at your company than others. Clustering algorithms can also be very helpful when you're dealing with sort of unsupervised machine learning. So you might not necessarily have labels for your data, or you don't necessarily know what the relationship might look like, but you're looking at sort of clusters or groups within your data, data points or people or phenomena that are similar to others and different from others. This is something we've done at Attuned as well back in the day when we were doing research. Is we've looked at people's employee engagement survey results and their job seeking activity, and we found 3 different clusters. One cluster was people who were highly engaged and their job seeking activity was low. So there's no surprise there, people who were engaged and they weren't really looking for a new job. We found another cluster whose engagement level was lower, but their job seeking activity was very, very high. So they were less happy than the first cluster and they were really, really actively looking for a new job. And this but the job seeking activity wasn't very high. So it turns out that it's not the most disengaged people at your company who are going to leave. It's very often the most disengaged people are going to stay put and they're just gonna be unhappy and turn toxic after a while. We don't necessarily know the reason for this, but it's an interesting thing to know when you're dealing with employee turnover, that it's often not the people you want to leave who are going to leave in the end. It's very often the people that you could actually keep who are not too disengaged in the end, but they have a higher job seeking activity. So it's interesting to look at clusters. You can uncover a lot by doing that. And just one last message looking at algorithms is none of these algorithms are perfect. So they all have a certain success rate, if you will. And it's very important as an HR technology buyer to understand the success rate of the algorithms that your vendor is using. And here I just want to introduce you to 2 basic sort of error types. One is the false positive. As you can see, when here the doctor is telling the gentleman that he's pregnant, obviously he's not. So this is a false positive. And the type 2 error is the false negative, and the doctor is telling the obviously pregnant lady that she's not pregnant. And it's helpful to know what type of error you can accept. What is the trade-off for you in a specific case? For example, when you're trying to diagnose a serious disease like cancer, it's much better to have false positives than have false negatives. It's better to falsely diagnose some people as having cancer than not catching some people who actually do have it. So in this case, it's very clear what the trade-off is. You want false positives rather than false negatives. Depending on what the use case is, for example, this can be different. In a hiring process, it's very interesting to think about what has the bigger consequences for you. Is it hiring people who will turn out to be underperformance, or is it not hiring people who will turn out to be top performers? And the answer can differ depending on the role, the seniority, and the country. So that was it from me. And now I'd like to open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and fire away, and hopefully you can continue the conversation for a few more minutes.
Fantastic, Daniel. That was very interesting. This is Casey returning here as the moderator. But I really found that quite insightful, and I kind of knew what you were going to talk about. So thanks for bringing that data and those insights there. I do have a couple of questions here that I've received. And the steps that you've outlined, what do you think is typically the hardest for companies?
That's a very good question. I think one of them is just getting started. So I think the first step is it can often feel quite overwhelming because typically you're dealing with very big, unstructured, complex problems, and since people analytics is such a new field, you don't really have a recipe for how to approach this. So I think it's just getting started can be quite difficult. Another step that can be quite difficult is something we've not covered today, but I think it falls under the subject of change management, is that once you have your data, once you have your analysis, once you have your sort of action points, that's when the hard work really starts. You actually have to implement those actions. You have to drive organizational change. You have to get buy-in from line managers, from executives, from employees, and that is a whole different topic on itself. Maybe we can do another webinar on that at some point.
Absolutely, I'm learning a ton, so I'd be happy to do another webinar. I've got another question that I received, and this might be kind of simple and straightforward, but what makes people analytics different from the way that HR was used before, the data in HR was used previously?
Another great question. So HR has been using data for decades, right? So we've had a lot of data already in HR. I think there are maybe three things that we can mention here. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, is people analytics is trying to connect the dots a lot more. So looking at data points sitting in different parts of the organizations and really trying to break down those data silos and connect the dots between these data points is one thing. The other thing, of course, is the use of advanced analytical methods like machine learning. And so a lot more of the analytics that we do now in HR is predictive and helps decision making a lot more than just sort of descriptive analytics. And maybe the third thing is this focus on business problems. I think that's getting a lot more prominent these days. HR is becoming a lot more important due to the fast changes in the labor market, the talent shortages in many developed countries, the need to reskill employees. So HR is becoming a lot more critical part of the business than before, and the focus on business problems is maybe another difference.
Nice, thanks for that. Got another one here. So what's the best way for people to get started with building analytics capability in their organization? Should they start internally or work with kind of external vendors or consultants?
Yeah, I think there are different ways to get started. So a lot of companies start by working with consultants. They engage consultants to kind of help them create a people analytics roadmap, maybe create a few quick wins, success stories internally to convince the and then after a while, they might start out building out a people analytics team of their own, hire a VP of people analytics, and then people analytics business partners, data scientists, and so on.
That's great. Well, those are all the questions I've received thus far. So Daniel, I'd like to thank you for your insights. I found it extremely helpful in understanding people analytics and getting started better. And you know, I've been exposed to the field, so, but I just love the way that you presented everything here in a format that we can all learn from. So we will be sharing this publicly. So everybody will be able to view this later and also see the different slides. You can also get in contact with Daniel Bedogne directly through Twitter or through us here at Attuned, or myself, Casey, if you have any questions. But Daniel, thanks so much for your time early in the morning there in Budapest. I think it was awesome having an expert in people analytics here with us today at Attuned.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it, and I hope as many of our listeners as possible can get started with people analytics this year.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us, and hope you have a good evening for those of us that have joined here in Asia. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.